Hello, everyone. I'm Susan Lowenberg, producing director of LA Theater Works. The 40-year saga of three Japanese Americans who challenged the incarceration of over 100,000 of their fellow citizens is a powerful, heart-wrenching story captured beautifully in Jeanne Sakata's play For Us All, which focuses on the coram nobis case of Fred Korematsu. Jeanne's story is especially poignant given the atmosphere in America in 2021, which has seen an alarming rise in racist language and violence toward Asian Americans. The battle for social justice is hardly over. That's why we're glad to have a distinguished panel joining us today to talk about the events in For Us All, including playwright Jeanne Sakata and key members of the team who worked on the landmark cases in the 1980s. Peter?
I'm Peter Irons. I'm a retired constitutional law professor at the University of California in San Diego. And I started working on a book about the internment cases back in 1981. We're still not done, of course. This goes on, and educating new generations is very, very important. Right now, I have just finished a book. It's called White Men's Law, The Roots of Systemic Racism.
I'm Dale Minami. I'm a senior counsel at the Minami Tamaki, LLP, a law firm in San Francisco. I was the lead counsel for Fred Korematsu with a team of about 10 attorneys, which reopened his case based on the research from Peter and also Aiko Yoshinaga Herzig. Now I've been spending most of my time with the project that started with Don Tamaki called Stop Repeating History, and trying to draw the parallels between past events and current situation, which is deplorable given the amount of anti-Asian hate crimes and violence that we see every day.
Lori?
I'm Lori Bannai. I teach at Seattle University School of Law, where I work with the Fred T. Korematsu Center for Law and Equality. So it's a real privilege and honor to continue to be working in Fred's name, doing civil rights litigation all over the country now. As Dale mentioned, a number of us who worked on Fred's case in the 1980s are still working together all these years later in this campaign, Stop Repeating History. I just come out with a co-authored book called Race, Rights, and National Security, Law and the Japanese American Incarceration.
Thank you. Don?
Hello, I'm Don Tamaki. My day job is senior counsel at Minami Tamaki LLP. And because, as Lori has said, the relevance of Korematsu, regrettably, is probably more pertinent and more relevant today than it was when we reopened Fred's case in the 1980s. We promised Fred, actually, when we started this case, that win or lose, we would educate the American public about the perils to democracy when systemic racism and alternative facts replaced the real ones that in 1942 resulted in a civil liberties disaster. Unfortunately, a lot of those themes are continuing to repeat themselves. So we've launched a public awareness campaign to remind the public and the courts and our democratic institutions that we must be ever vigilant against history repeating itself.
Thank you, Don. Jeanne?
Hi, I'm Jeanne Sakata. I'm an actor and a playwright. I started out as an actor at East West Players here in Los Angeles in Little Tokyo, first Asian American theater company. And my life was actually changed by a play I saw, a Japanese American playwright in Nisei, Wakako Yamauchi, who wrote a play called And the Soul Shall Dance. And I actually did not know at the time, I was a young student at UCLA, and I didn't even know there were plays about Japanese American farming families like the one I had come from. So this play changed my life. And I started out as an actor at East West Players, and I continued on with that until the 1990s, when I learned about an amazing man named Gordon Hirabayashi, a Nisei man of my father's generation, who openly defied and legally challenged a racist curfew and Executive Order 9066 that the government orders that were issued for Japanese Americans on the West Coast to be forcibly removed from their homes and put into prison camps in the desert. And I had not known of Gordon's story. I'd never really heard the details of it. And I was fascinated by it and riveted. And it drove me to do all the research that I could about Gordon and to meet him and interview him. And that led to the writing of a solo show called Hold These Truths, which has been touring the country for the past 13 years. We've been very blessed in how much interest there's been in this play. And there will be a couple productions actually coming up this year. And that also led to LA Theater Works recording that play. And happily, you commissioned me to write this new play for us all, which is about the Quorum Novus battle of Fred Korematsu and the attorneys here with us today that led that battle. So I am now also a playwright, and I'm trying to juggle these two careers. And it's a real blessing to be able to have two avenues of self-expression as an Asian American artist.
Jeanne, you're balancing beautifully, I must say.
Oh, thank you. It's a challenge, but thank you.
Before we get started with our panelists, though, I'd like to know what were the particular challenges that you faced in writing For Us All and Hold These Truths, which we recorded in 2019?
Yes. Well, both of these stories were of great historical significance in the history of American civil rights. But in a very personal level for me, they filled in, I think, a part of my psyche where there was a great gap, a great hole, because my family never talked about their experiences with the camps. The challenges of both of these stories were that they were big, complex, multifaceted stories with a great variety and number of characters and incidents. And it was a challenge to distill all of this complexity down into the requirements of a good dramatic play, which has the requirements of, for example, characters that each have to have an arc and a path of growth in the play. And there has to be dramatic tension, the heart of drama is conflict. So there has to be sustained conflict from each scene in the play flowing into the next. Each scene has to have a beginning, middle, and end. The play has to start off with a powerful moment, build to a climax, and in between, there's got to be a balance of tension and drama with humor, because humor is a great tool to, keep the audience connected to your story. So with both of these plays, I love the term history play, which I actually got from an interview with David Hare, who wrote a play called Stuff Happens about the Iraq War and the Bush administration and all the characters that were involved in discussions and implementation of policy about that. And a history play to me means that it's a blend, hopefully an artful blend of fact and fiction. All four of these attorneys told me such wonderful stories. There was just a plethora, and you can only include a fraction because of the time limit. But this should really be a mini series. Gordon's story and the story of Fred's Quorum Novus battle, they should both be mini series, in my opinion. So
Jeanne, do you want to take over now for me and interview our panelists?
Yes, that would be my honor. And thank you again, Dale, Don, Lori, and Peter for joining us today. It's a real honor to ask you these questions. Peter, I am going to start with you. For Us All opens with that very powerful moment in DC when you first opened the box that's been untouched for 40 years, covered with dust. It's labeled Korematsu versus the United States. and you look at the very first document line on top. Now, you told me you were stunned by that document and the rest of the contents of the box. Can you tell us why that was and why you immediately called Aiko Hertz Yoshinaga after you examined the contents of that box?
Well, this is a fascinating story because it really, although it's factual, you really couldn't make this kind of stuff up. So many things happened that were total coincidences. You couldn't have foreseen them, leading us to where we are right now. But back in 1981, I decided to write a book about the Supreme Court cases of Gordon, Fred, and Min. I had never met a Japanese American person before that. And in my constitutional law class at Harvard Law School, Professor Larry Tribe, who most people know about, was discussing these cases and making it clear, just from the excerpts that we read in the case book, how horrible this decision was. And so I decided to look at how the court handled these cases, because at the time, in 1943 and 1944, the members of the Supreme Court were probably the most liberal that we've had in our history. People like Felix Frankfurter, William O. Douglas, Frank Murphy, Hugo Black, Harlan Stone. These were, great justices. But particularly in Gordon's case, the first that came up, they made a terrible decision. They based it really on racist stereotypes that had been given to them by the government's lawyers in their briefs and arguments. And when I got to working on the case, and as Don said, this was the case of a lifetime. All of us, Lori, Don, Dale, and everybody else who worked on this knows that this was the most important case they were likely to ever handle. And so that's how we got started. And there's, of course, a lot of stories about getting together for the first time with the lawyers in San Francisco, going over to Fred's house and having a meeting with him. Fred actually thought these were all like high school kids because they were so young at the time. I was the oldest of them in my early 40s.
Thank you so much. And that actually leads right into my next question, which is for you, Don Tamaki. Thank you for joining us. So my question for you, Don, is in addition to preparing for Fred's court battle, you attorneys felt it was of equal importance to use the case to educate the American public about the World War II Japanese American camp experience. Now, you were in charge of this public education campaign for which you said there were 3 goals. Can you share with us what those goals were?
Thank you. I think even before I talk about that, I do want to express our heartfelt gratitude to Peter Irons and Aiko Yoshinaga Hertzik. I think the public owes them a great debt, but the legal team, everybody who participated in this case, it did change our lives. And the reason why it did change our lives is because we were so personally connected to the whole thing. It was our families who were incarcerated. It was our families who were so traumatized that they never discussed their experience. After the camps closed, people returned to the very communities that exiled them in the first place. And the lesson was anything connected with being Japanese and your culture and your language should be abandoned. And you should become as white as you can, as fast as you can, and keep a low profile, keep your mouth shut. And so an entire generation of people didn't talk about this, to the great loss to the American history and the public. And it was really Peter and Aiko that by accident found these documents after 37 years. And it was Peter who knew the significance of them. Having done his own Coram Nobis case, he found a vehicle that was not subject to any statute of limitations. There were really 3 purposes. One was to impair, discredit, undermine, overrule this landmark case, Korematsu versus the United States, because it was bad then in 1942. It's a horrible precedent continuing forward. Justice Jackson wrote in his dissent, the case lies around like a loaded weapon, ready for the hand of any authority who could put forth a plausible claim of an urgent need. Meaning, without trial, without evidence, without any due process, an entire racial group could be rounded up and imprisoned and made to lose their property and their freedom, and for some even their lives, with no legal recourse. So that is a very dangerous precedent. The second thing, however, was to educate the American public about what happened. And this is what so important about what Peter and I co-found. But what began as wartime hysteria, people being scared, ultimately ended up at the highest echelons of our legal system as a calculated plan to uphold the validity of this rounding up of Americans without trial and for no offense, even if it meant lying to the US Supreme Court. Mm-hmm. Now that revealed it wasn't a mistake, it wasn't a tragedy, it wasn't just a bad decision, it was a scandal of epic proportions. It represented the undermining of the whole judicial system, and the victims of that whole process were Japanese Americans, and the precedent was set so it left the door open for future victims of any other marginalized group. So we had to do whatever we could to educate the public, and we promised Fred, win or lose, it was our mission for as long as we were alive to basically inform the public of what happened. So we're very grateful. And I'm glad personally that we kept our promise to Fred. The third thing was to vindicate our families. So, as you know, this was a very personal thing for all of us. And as our parents and our families really never talked about it because we were so traumatized about it, the play, depicts Fred Korematsu not even telling his daughter, Karen, about what he had went through, that he was the subject of a landmark US Supreme Court case and that he lost. And so the fact that we could vindicate our families who basically kind of lived in shame as if they had done something wrong. And so they never talked about it. And it's no wonder that they felt that way. I mean, the case went up to the US Supreme Court, he lost. I think people concluded that if the court rules against you, you must have been guilty of something, disloyalty, espionage. You're something less than being American. You are a foreigner, basically. So it was very important from our own vindication of our families that we set that out. And by doing so, I think we taught the country a lesson, and we continue to do so. I think Fred's case is a textbook lesson on the meaning of the Constitution, and the fact that you can't take your civil liberties for granted.
Well, Dale, you attorneys were strategizing and preparing for the Korematsu, Yasu, and Hirabayashi cases. At the same time, there was a movement and campaign for Japanese American redress happening for monetary reparations and a government apology. What, if any, was the relationship between the redress movement and these three cases?
Well, the redress movement started in the early 70s, and resolutions were passed, legislation was passed, but it actually lost steam and didn't go anywhere till probably the late 70s. And so our cases arose in 1981 and 82 when Peter found the evidence. And it was right in the midst of a battle by the Japanese American community and their allies of all colors to try to get legislation to get the government to apologize and issue redress payments of $20,000, as well as an educational fund in redress for what happened to Japanese Americans. The problem in Congress was that the opponents of redress were arguing that the Supreme Court had already ruled on these in Korematsu, Hirabayashi, and Yasui, so that what was done to Japanese Americans was validated by the highest court of our land. Part of our other purpose in winning these cases was to get a judicial declaration. We needed an antidote. We needed a counter to the arguments made by opponents in Congress that what was done to Japanese Americans was both legal and moral. I mean, you could argue that it was not moral, clearly, because the constitutional rights were all ignored and neglected. But what we wanted is a finding of fact that there was racism that fueled the incarceration and the decisions that were made, that the Japanese Americans were not guilty of espionage or sabotage, as was argued in the Supreme Court with the evidence that was discovered, and that Japanese Americans were not as a whole disloyal or have a propensity for disloyalty, as was alleged in the Supreme Court. So we needed a judicial declaration. We needed a counterweight to those arguments. So that was another really important, I think, part of our claim.
Welcome. And now, Lori Bannai, welcome. I just wanted to say that Lori's wonderful book, Enduring Conviction, right here. I relied on heavily to write sections of this play, as well as Peter's book, Justice Delayed. I want to put in a plug for anyone listening to this panel to read these two books to, get the actual facts of what happened in the actual history. But my question for you, Lori, is that these coram nobis cases may have taken place in the 1980s, but many say their cases, these cases and their ramifications have very powerful significance for our country today. And I would like to ask how you view the present day relevance of these cases to our current political situation, including the anti-Asian hostility and violence we're experiencing now, tragically, and Trump versus Hawaii.
Thank you so much, Jeannie, and thank you for this wonderful play, and to LA Theater Works for producing it. I think the coram nobis cases can be viewed in a couple of different ways. As we've already talked about, it, along with the movement for redress that Dale just talked about, can be viewed as winning a measure of justice for the Japanese American community. And it was really significant for us, for our families and our community, for so many of the reasons that have already been discussed. But more broadly, of course, it can be viewed as one battle in a long war in this country against racism and intolerance and harming and scapegoating communities of color in this country, which is why Don and Dale and those of us continuing to talk about the incarceration continue to talk about it, because it really is a powerful example of the need to continue speaking out against these injustices. Of course, any understanding of the World War II incarceration has to start with an understanding of the history of hostility against Japanese Americans, Asian Americans, people of color, immigrant communities in this country. So what we're seeing today really just harkens back to the feeling about Japanese Americans as foreign, as forever foreign in this country. A history of animosity against Japanese Americans and other Asian Americans that view them as subhuman, that subjected them to discriminatory and exclusionary laws that prevented them from becoming citizens, from owning land, from intermarrying with whites. And that hostility wasn't the same as, but it certainly grew from the same hostility experienced by other immigrants and other marginalized groups in this country. The Japanese American incarceration has been repeatedly in the news. So even though we now have talked about Japanese American incarceration being relevant to Trump versus Hawaii and the new anti-Asian, the resurgence of Japanese American anti-Asian violence, it's come up repeatedly in the news over the years, whenever the country has turned against a vulnerable minority. So during the Gulf War, there was discussion about rounding up people of Middle Eastern descent, and the Korematsu case came up with an article that said, remembering Korematsu, that the Arabs are the Japanese of 1991. In 2015, the mayor of Roanoke, Virginia, David Bowers, asked city agencies to refuse to provide assistance to Syrian refugees, saying that an example was set by what happened during World War II to Japanese Americans. We can do the same thing again. So it's not, the Korematsu case, unfortunately, has come up repeatedly every time the government turns against a vulnerable minority. So, of course, as you asked, the Japanese American incarceration was in the news again. when President Trump issued a travel ban order against mainly Muslim majority countries. And as the cases worked their way up through the courts, the judges in these cases asked, isn't this just like Korematsu? And the government said, it's not like Korematsu. Those of us who represented Fred and the lawyers who represented Minyasui and Gordon Hirabayashi filed a brief actually before the Supreme Court against the travel ban, urging the court to remember the lessons of the Japanese American incarceration and not let stereotypes and the branding of Muslims as terrorists feed official policy. In 2018, however, as everybody knows, the US Supreme Court upheld the travel ban and said that it was constitutional. So I suppose what I in this moment of anti-Asian violence, I come to this like we all come to this in this moment where I think many of us felt truly speechless in light of these attacks. In light of the model minority myth, we see again how Asian Americans are forever foreign. Seen as these early laws in the 1900s or late 1800s, Asian Americans were treated as sources of disease and a danger to this country. And we see it again now, brand new. And it's the same othering that's been present against the Black community, Indigenous communities, other immigrant communities, different in kind, but similar dehumanization. So where I come from is the need that every person needs to be vigilant and speak up. Japanese Americans stood largely alone during World War II. None of the major civil rights organizations spoke up in defense of Japanese American community when it happened. And the need for communities of color to work together and in coalition with each other. So it was said earlier that Don said that we promised Fred we would keep on fighting as long as we lived. And I remember that Fred at the press conference after he won his case said, one thing I want to do is to make sure that I want my lawyers to continue to fight until this will never happen to anyone again. And I think part of us, me, was kind of tired and thought, okay, Fred, that's what you want us to do. That's what we're gonna do. And the fight to make sure this never happens to anyone again is a long fight. So we're hanging in there.
Did the Korematsu and Hirabayashi and Masui cases, did it change what you thought about yourselves and the law and your careers?
You know, I was in private practice and I had been practicing civil rights law. And I had read these decisions. I was deeply cynical about the law in the Supreme Court. And with the evidence Peter found, you know, it made me even more cynical that we could not trust the Supreme Court to do justice. Over the years, you know, we've seen the courts act in a very responsible way, stopping some of the Trump's initiatives. So that had mollified me a little bit so that I could really believe that there is some justice out there. But with the Supreme Court we have now, and what I suspect is going to happen, I'm not sure we're going to get the type of justice I feel. And maybe it's personal, but I believe a lot of others feel, especially marginalized group like Lori says, will get the kind of justice that we feel is due.
Peter is right. This was a case of a lifetime, and you know that had some good and bad to it. I mean, we were young when we did this, and the running joke was, it's been downhill ever since. You know, when you climb the mountaintop. From an understanding of how change happens in America, and how continuing forces of racism, nativism, isolationism, all of the isms continue. I think the case was an education to me. It enhanced my thinking and it reaffirmed it. And that, like, for example, you know, General DeWitt, one of the architects of the incarceration, said a Jap's a Jap. The very fact that no espionage or sabotage has occurred is a disturbing indication that it will occur. This is the kind of crazy conspiracy thinking that were pervasive and infected at very high levels, including people like Earl Warren, who was then Attorney General, who ran for governor of California on that basis, on that slogan, long before he became redemptively a Supreme Court justice that led a unanimous court in upholding Brown versus Board of Education, winning that case. So, DeWitt was the QAnon of his day. There are parallels there, and that is, when these alternative facts, quote unquote, hold sway over the real ones. The facts don't matter, the law doesn't matter, lawyers don't matter. If the culture says, we're going to lock these people up, you're going to get locked up. And so that's what said to me, the education part is so important to change this culture. Dale has said this over and over again. In order to have real change in America, long-lasting change, we need to change this culture of prejudice. And so that part about the lesson of Korematsu really got reaffirmed over the last few decades. I think that still holds true.
I've certainly made most of my career out of writing and speaking about the incarceration. And Dale and Don do so much of that. Our colleague Eric Yamamoto is a professor at the University of Hawaii, who's one of the most noted scholars in the area of the wartime incarceration and its present day relevance and reparations. And so many of us have really been, this has become our life's work, or a lot of the work that we've done. And in part because we see exactly what Don just said, the importance of the public education, that I think, in my mind, I think there's some deniers out there who think that what happened during Japanese American incarceration was totally right. But a lot of people really get the idea that it's wrong. They were American citizens. And so I think one thing that really motivates me is that talking about the Japanese American incarceration is a really, really important and good starting off point for conversations about and dialogues about discrimination against other groups. That if people can see that what happened to Japanese Americans was wrong, the Muslim travel ban hopefully is not that far away to be able to see the same prejudice or fear. A lot of people say, well, we can do other things because it's not Korematsu. But if you can get them to see that it is Korematsu, maybe we can make some headway.
One of the things that makes me a little different from Don and Lori and Dale is that before I got into this, simply as an academic, I'd had no connection with Japanese Americans or any other Asian group. I lived in a little white upper middle class bubble, and we didn't pay much attention, even when I was growing up, to the racial discrimination and hatred of the Jim Crow era. I'm probably one of the few people around today that actually went to a grade school that was legally segregated before Brown in Delaware. People don't understand that it lasted long before that. And so for me, as a sort of honorary Haikujin, it is important that those of us who aren't from that culture, aren't from that group, understand what happened to them, and also understand that it can happen to any other group, marginalized, minority groups. The thing that struck me the most in reading these Supreme Court opinions at the very beginning when I was in law school, particularly Gordon Hirabayashi's case, which was decided unanimously by the Supreme Court, was based on racial stereotypes that still exist, that Japanese Americans, as the court said, are not assimilated as an integral part of the white community. Well, why weren't they assimilated? Because the white community treated them as subhuman or dangerous, and in fact, isolated them geographically and culturally, so that most people like myself would never have any contact with this particular culture or other minority cultures. And one of the things that I've done in the book I just completed about white men's law and how it is the root of systemic racism is that from the very beginning of this country's settlement and growth, this stereotyping of minorities has gone on, and it has only exacerbated in the last 4 years during the prior administration. And so it's very important. If we can come out of that bad time, to understand that there is more to America than just, white middle class people, and be aware of, conscious of, empathetic toward the hardships that people are facing simply because of their color, their ancestry, their religion, and to make sure that this becomes a country based on e pluribus unum. That is, out of many, we are one. Well, we're not one yet. And we've got to make sure that the many that make up this country understand each other and can understand where we come from and how we have to live together to make us work.
Peter, I wonder if you could tell us a little more about your friendship with Aiko and also her husband, Jack Herzig. You beginning with one of my favorite stories, which is when you first visited Aiko's apartment and what you saw there, and then subsequently how you and Aiko and Jack became such good friends.
Well, that is a collaboration that I think is astounding, in the sense that somebody from that culture and somebody from my culture got together and worked so well. The interesting thing about meeting Aiko and her husband, Jack, after all, was a Caucasian who had been in World War II, fought in the Pacific, had been in Army intelligence. And so he was able to bring a perspective when we looked at all these documents of how the military had concealed the racist underpinnings of the internment itself. And so Aiko and I started working together. We became very close friends. We'd go out to dinner together. And when I visited Washington to do research, I would stay with them in their condo. And it was quite a thing, because every square inch, literally, was filled with documents. Not only the living room, Jack and Aiko's bedroom, the guest room, and the bathroom were all full of boxes and documents and folders. Aiko was a tremendous researcher and cataloger. Mm-hmm. So she could put her finger, this was before computers, of course, she could put her finger on virtually any page that she thought was important to get out, and go run over and pull it out and bring it back and say, see, here's what I mean. And so the three of us together made a really good team. We had a lot of fun. We drank a lot of scotch, and we basically, but before we got into this with Fred and Gordon and Min and Dale and Don and Lori and all the other lawyers and law students, I had developed a tremendous respect for somebody who was so intent on bringing the history before the people and before the courts. She literally devoted her whole life to this. And Jack, too, although they're not with us anymore, deserve immense credit, particularly in finding the missing copy of General DeWitt's final report, in which it became obvious that they knew this was a racist motivation and tried to cover it up. They weren't successful, fortunately, but when it came up to the Supreme Court, and I'm really sorry to say this, that someone as distinguished as Solicitor General Fahey, who later went on to be a federal appeals court judge and very well respected, could have swallowed his conscience in the service of a policy that he knew was wrong. And that's what really got to me about this.
Don, I'm going to ask you a question now. You said you witnessed Fred's evolution during the quorum nobis battle from someone who carried the burden of having lost his Supreme Court case in the 1940s and who did not want to speak at all to any groups of reporters, to someone who ended up traveling the country as a kind of impassioned speaker and ambassador about his case, and later on, after his case was decided, about civil rights for other groups. Can you tell us what it was like to watch that evolution of Fred?
Remarkable. It was a remarkable evolution. He went from a vilified Jap spy in the eyes of the mainstream community and the press, and in the eyes of Japanese Americans, he was seen as someone largely who would make their lives worse, and he didn't get a lot of support in the camps for his appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court. So he suffered a lot. So when we met with him, his children were very protective of him. They were suspicious of our motives because over the years, Fred had been the subject of many historian and scholarly, interest in basically what happened. But no one until Peter arrived offered any opportunity to actually change anything, to reverse the picture. So he went from being a vilified figure in American history to a civil rights icon. I mean, in California and in a number of states now, there is a Fred Korematsu Day. And universally, he's recognized now as a great American hero, not just a Japanese American figure, but a great American hero. And so when we met with him, clearly he was traumatized. I can't think of any other word. I mean, the last time he went before the courts prior to before Marilyn Hall Patel, he describes, appearing in shackles, his words. And we had to win them over, basically. And Peter did a great job in winning Fred over, that he could actually reopen his case. And he still did it at great personal peril. I think he lost his job because of it. And so it suddenly focused a great deal of attention on this guy that had never talked about this. He was president of the Lions Club. He was a member of his church, active in the community, and no one knew that actually he had led this very lonely solo fight almost before the U.S. Supreme Court, where even the most ardent civil liberties groups had basically turned their back on him and on Japanese Americans. Basically, at some point, he had to speak up because he was the one that the press and the public wanted to hear from. And over time, he became a terrific spokesperson. And I think it was totally a transformative thing for him. But I have to say, throughout, he remained a very humble person. And Karen Korematsu's daughter tells the story when when the White House had called and said President Clinton wants to give you the Medal of Freedom, which is the highest award for civilians in the United States. But then he asked, well, how would I get there? And and they said, well, you have to pay your own way, but it's a great honor for you to come. And Fred's response was, well, put it in the mail, his Medal of Freedom. And Karen and Ken said, no, we have to go. But it's just a reflection of basically who the man was. I mean, he was, Laurie's book talks about the letters he wrote to Ernest Bessick saying, this is a violation of people's civil rights. Japanese Americans should have every right for a trial that they can prove their loyalty. People didn't know that, and what a principled stand he took. Fred never featured that himself. He characterized it as a personal stand. But in his own quiet way, he really made a very, I get a bit emotional just.
One of the things that most struck me when I first met Gordon and Min and Fred separately was how much they differed from the stereotypes that had been promulgated for years and years and years, that Asians all, and this is applied to all kinds of minority groups, they all look alike. They all think alike. We can't even tell differences between them. And the amazing thing is that there are no three people I've ever met who were more different in their personalities and the way they, they talked and behaved than Gordon and Fred and Min. Min was a very bulldoggy kind of aggressive lawyer. He was a lawyer, and he thought the rest of us should look to him for advice. Gordon was the typical college professor, even with the tweed coat and the leather patches on the elbow, and the way he spoke very deliberately and articulately. And Fred was just every man. Fred was just like your next door neighbor who comes over to borrow your lawnmower and just chat with you. He was in all the groups in his town of San Leandro. And as Fred said, he didn't feel any different from anybody else until he started thinking about what made him different. And what made him different was that people saw him, as Fred once said, my crime was looking like the enemy.
Yeah, I'd like to add something to Don's story, if I could, Jeannie.
Yeah, sure.
When we started these cases, we understood the value of education. We knew win or lose, we had to educate this American public about the truth and about Japanese Americans. But we wanted to do this in an organized way. So we tabbed or asked Don to lead this whole educational effort, and he did a magnificent job. But in order to do this, we needed a voice, and the voice had to be Fred. So we kind of hatched a little bit of a plot. Lori was there when we tell Fred, look, you don't have to do any press conferences. If the press is on the lawn, we'll keep them away from you. Don't worry about having to speak. So then the first person we had was a Japanese American reporter. We said, well, maybe you could ask him this. And we monitored the type of questions he could ask Fred. And we said, Fred, would you mind just talking to this guy a little bit? He's a friend of ours, and he's just going to ask a couple simple questions. And so we started very slowly, and we started graduating, and this is through Don, of getting more and more reporters, more and more publicity, until, maybe about, 6-8 months later, the 60 Minutes crew shows up and wants to interview Fred. This is something Don arranged. And I remember them shooting Fred, and Fred by then had gotten used to the idea of talking in front of cameras. He got used to the idea of speaking out. He really found his voice. And I'm standing behind the camera with Catherine. I remember they're shooting with Ed Bradley, and Catherine said, I thought you told me we didn't have to do any press, and this is 60 Minutes. And I looked at her and I said, I lied. I'm sorry. We really needed you to do this, but we didn't want to have you do it if you really didn't want to, but it's really important. And Catherine, to her credit, is, she was really a smart woman, master's degree. She grew up in South Carolina, met Fred in Detroit, and became really part of an ally of this whole group that we had, part of the central part of the group. One other thing I'd like to say is about Catherine and Fred. Every year I do this question and answer with my kids' elementary school, and they put on a play with a hat that has the face of Peter Irons and Fred and Karen and Catherine and Fred. The one thing they always ask is, what was Fred like? And I would tell them once, there are a lot of things you could say about Fred. Don mentioned some of them, as well as Peter. But the one thing I remember is they just loved people and they loved to party. And as everyone will attest, they would be the last ones to leave a party. And it would be like 2-3 o'clock sometimes. And Karen, their Fred's daughter, Fred and Catherine's daughter, and son-in-law would have to drag them, literally almost drag them out of the party because they were the last ones there. So they really loved to socialize and hang out with all of us, and we really enjoyed that.
So at the very beginning, you've heard some about it, despite the fact that Fred, everything he had gone through, he was, of course, really cordial the first time that we met him. And one thing I will say is that maybe early on, some people said that he told Peter that he might have been ashamed. Certainly never, ever had the sense that he was ashamed about what he had done. He did it. He knew he did it for the right reasons. Never ashamed about his wartime decision. And then most meaningful to me, and I think to all of us who worked on the case, is that they really started to treat us like family. Fred always greeted us really, really warmly. When I think about him, I think about his really big smile and how he would see the women on the case and give us a kiss on the cheek and a hug. The guys didn't get the kiss on the cheek. Your loss. And Catherine worried about how we were doing. Catherine, as Dale said, was just really, we talked so much about Fred, but she was really, really the remarkable partner in all things. But she also worried about whether we were getting to eat okay, worried about who we were dating and how the relationships were going. Asked about my father, asked about our families. And Karen, for me, became a sister and still remains a sister from another mister. And these relationships have become really important to us. We all came to love Fred and Catherine and his family, and they came to care for us and certainly call us members of their own family. Now, that's unusual for lawyers. I mean, let's put that out there, right? That lawyers don't do this. You don't become, most lawyers will not become friends or certainly family of their clients because you need to maintain a professional distance to be able to do your work. But this case was certainly, as you've heard, more than a case. It was a cause, and it was a cause that involved our own families. And then in addition, the Korematsus weren't just any other clients. You know, they were really warm. They cared about us as people, and they knew what these cases meant for us. And they really appreciated and kind of what they saw us doing, not only for the family, but for the cause. And so anyway, it's a relationship I know we all treasure.
Jeanne Sakata, Peter Irons, Dale Minami, Lori Bannai, and Don Tamaki, thank you so much for speaking with us today.